What are the differences between unreliable narrators in novels and films? And can unreliable narrators also exist in real life? Watch this video and find out. If you have seen our previous videos, you already know what an unreliable narrator is. You also know how to interpret and analyze this device. But the unreliable narrator is not just a feature of literary narratives. We also see lots of them in films. Think of American Beauty, Memento and Fight Club. But also video games like Call of Juarez that my colleague Frank analyzes in his video. The popularity of this device tells us that audiences enjoy being put on the wrong foot and having their expectations challenged. In fiction, that is. It is time to look at unreliable narration that travels across media, from literature to film, but also outside of fiction, for instance on social media. First, it is important to note that different media have different affordances for conveying unreliability. Literature is particularly effective in establishing effects of ambiguity. This is due to the many gaps to be filled in by readers, which invite inferences. Language also has the capacity to render the thoughts, feelings, and motivations of characters. These aspects of people's mental life normally remain hidden. In film, visual details and point of view are concrete and determined. The medium therefore holds more control over viewers' attention than literature. It is also more limited in presenting mental states. But film has multiple modalities to make up for this, like moving image, sound and music, spoken and written language, as you see here. As you will know from Frank's video, video games can use all of these same modalities, but add a level of interactivity. Players enact the story through their actions and choices while navigating the virtual story world. So each of these elements, as well as the discrepancies between them, can be used to convey effects of unreliability. Unreliability can also exist in non-fictional narratives, such as autobiography or memoirs. But there, the situation is a little bit different from what we have been describing. While reading fiction, we are said to occupy two positions at once: suspension of disbelief and an awareness of fictitiousness. In autobiography or memoir, we typically only occupy one of these positions. For instance, in the case of James Frey's memoir about his history of addiction and crime, which turned out to be fully made up. We are either in the know with respect to such unreliable elements, or we are not. This is so because author and narrator positions are said to be collapsed into one. Likewise, a newspaper article can be unreliable if it misleads us about what actually happened. Being misleading in this sense requires a disparity between the world as it is and the world as it is represented to be. Let's now look at the example for today, the novel and film Gone Girl. The novel is a psychological thriller. It was written by Gillian Flynn and published in 2012. The film adaptation was made by David Fincher and came out in 2014. Gone Girl deals with the complexities of marriage, deception and media influence. The story centers around the married couple Nick and Amy Dunn. Their lives seem perfect until Amy goes missing on their 5th wedding anniversary. As the investigation progresses, evidence begins to point towards Nick being the prime suspect. But then there are some dark and unexpected twists. So if you still want to read the novel or watch the film, you can now stop this video and continue after you did that, because there will be some major spoilers. It turns out that Amy has staged her own murder to try and frame Nick for it. And she did this because he cheated on her and she became disillusioned with the marriage. Nick struggles to prove his innocence as the media frenzy unfolds. Eventually, Amy returns, claiming she was kidnapped and managed to escape. And she traps Nick back into the marriage by faking a pregnancy. So, let us see how unreliable narration is established in the novel. In the first half, every other chapter is from Amy's diary and set in the past. The alternating chapters show Nick in the present trying to prove his innocence. Amy is not an unreliable narrator only, but there are several different versions of Amy as well. So first, the voice of Diary Amy that you see here is a persona constructed in order to fit the news media's ideal victim. Diary Amy seems reasonably reliable, if only maybe a bit naive, as you can see in this quote. And from now on, you can simply pause the video to read the longer quotes. Her diary entries expose Nick as a violent and dangerous man without explicitly saying so we think he is the unreliable narrator. And Nick's account indeed appears more untrustworthy because he tries to convince us of his innocence, while Amy's diary is believed to be private and thus less likely to contain lies. We doubt Nick's reliability in quotes that you see here, when he expresses his fondness for the lie of omission, as he calls it. After raising doubts about Nick's reliability to generate suspense, the real Amy surprises readers with the revelation that she was in fact the brilliant liar and manipulator all along. So when we look at Amy and Nick as unreliable narrators, we can use the three theoretical paradigms that I mentioned in the last video. From the rhetorical perspective, we can analyze how, behind the narrator Amy's back, the implied author communicates with the reader. Of Diary Amy, the implied author communicates that she is too naive to see that she is actually in danger. And of Actual Amy, the implied author communicates that she is delusional and that her morals are not okay, to say the least. From the structuralist perspective, we can look at clues in the text that one of them is lying. For instance, when Nick says something to the detectives that clashes with something that he says later to his sister, or when he comes across as very nervous in his testimony. Then from a cognitivist perspective, we first construe the hypothesis that Nick is unreliable. Then in light of the twist, we have to go back and change our hypothesis by postulating Amy as an unreliable narrator. And we also use cultural frames and schemes in our minds to interpret the novel, for instance, about gender differences. We can also look at Fallon's different axes of unreliability. If you remember, facts and events, interpretations and values. With respect to facts and events, Amy is extremely unreliable. She manipulates and lies to the other characters and the readers. Especially in her fabricated diary, misreporting is basically all that she does. For example, in one of the diary entries, Amy recounts how Nick's mother is taking her to donate blood plasma. Amy cannot go through with it because she has a terrible fear of blood. And then in the second part of the novel, Amy admits to misreporting here, as you can see in the quote. While Amy engages in misreporting, Nick tends to underreport. He withholds information, not just from the audience, but also from himself. He is in denial about his own flaws and about the reality of his marriage. So then thirdly, we have the axis of interpretation and understanding. Apart from the intentional misinterpretations found in her diary, Amy hardly ever mis- or underinterprets at all. She is very clever and she's good at mind reading. One exception is when Nick tries to manipulate her back by recording a video in which he says that he still loves her and wants her back. Amy then falls for this trap and believes him because this is in fact her weak spot. And when it comes to ethics and values, Amy often deviates from the implied author's judgments. A small example is when she spits into her friend's food when she is mad at her, thinking that that might be a reasonable response. She also believes that one has to pretend to be a different kind of person to win someone over, and that this is true love. And as a result, we are constantly balancing between what Amy thinks is reasonable, what we infer that the implied author finds reasonable, and what we ourselves think is reasonable in such a scenario. So when we now turn to the film, Fincher makes clever use of cinematic techniques to enhance this sense of unreliable narration. For instance, in his use of flashbacks, which are later revealed to be fabrications. A difference with the novel, which is made out of language, of course, is that here we see the fabricated scenes unfold before our very eyes, just as we see the events that truly happened. For instance, when we see Nick throwing Amy to the ground during a fight. Unlike with texts, which can project a fantasy, we tend to think that seeing equals believing. To depict images that later turn out to have been false can therefore generate quite powerful effects. And also, in films, the narration is established through more than one modality, as said. We do not just have the spoken language and the voiceover, but also the moving images and the music. In the case of Gone Girl, this is very important because sometimes what the audience sees and what they are told does not quite match up. For instance, when Nick finds the second clue of a scavenger hunt that his wife has arranged for him. He reads it next to the detective and tells her he has no idea where it leads. But the next thing we see here is that Nick goes to the location where the clue leads. So the ability for the audience to spot these lies depends on the double narration. Unreliable narrators also tell us something about the prevailing norms in certain cultural and historical contexts. Recently, 2 points of critique have been raised against stories that use the fictional device for our amusement. One is about gender, and the other one is about mental health, and both can be applied to Gone Girl. The novel Gone Girl is an example of the so-called domestic noir subgenre of thrillers. After the Me Too movement, with its slogan #BelieveWomen, this genre was criticized for featuring female narrators with untrustworthy judgments and perceptions. This reinforces misogynistic cultural stereotypes. Flynn's novel is a little bit different in that it inverts the generic trope of a male figure controlling a woman. But still, Amy's testimony is not to be believed. She is manipulative, she lies about abuse, and likely suffers from a disorder. That brings me to the second point of critique. This is related to the subtype of unreliable narrator that is sometimes called the madman type. Here, a narrator's interpretations are distorted due to the fact that they suffer from mental health afflictions. In horror video games, for instance, this trope is so popular that it leads to a yearly challenge to develop a game without psychiatric institutes or insane patients, as you see here. Online, we find that the character Amy Dunn has been diagnosed with all kinds of disorders, from narcissism to borderline. Such practices have been criticized as ableist. Last, I will give one example of judgments of unreliability on social media. You've probably heard about the 2022 defamation trial of actress Amber Heard versus her former husband Johnny Depp. It was heavily mediatized and made into a Netflix documentary. It started when in 2018, Heard shared her story of domestic abuse with the newspaper. During this infamous trial, Depp's fans used social media to call Heard a real-life unreliable narrator, and some argued that her testimony showed suspicious similarities to Gone Girl, details from liquor bottles to self-addressed letters. Some even accused her of stealing IDs from the novel and film in order to make her case. They compared her psychological profile to that of Amy Dunn, as you see here. So how could this happen? Narratives on social media often have the form of many small stories that are fragmented, open-ended, and transposable. Online, narratives are placed in context beyond the teller's intentions. They are shared across multiple events with many unforeseen recipients. And these recipients actively contribute to the narrative by posting, commenting, sharing, and liking. This then often leads to conflicting stories that shape and co-construct the narrative. So in Amber Heard's case, her narrative went viral, severing the link between teller and experience. Her story was contested, discredited, and retold by unforeseen, distrusting audiences across all media. So what we see here is that readers use the device of the unreliable narrator to first diagnose a fictional character and then judge real-life people based on those diagnoses. We should always be critical of the implicit norms and judgment behind unreliable narration. In conclusion, we now know how we can analyze unreliable narration across media. We've also seen what some of the cultural implications may be. Now, for the assignment, we invite you to analyze either Gone Girl or your own case study in a medium of choice across media. Thank you for your attention.